Life has a cruel way of reopening wounds just when you believe they have finally healed. For 20 long years, I mourned my child. I told myself he was not buried in the ground, but in my memories, and I convinced myself I had learned to live with a silence inside this house that I once built with my late husband. Yet on that fateful day, when the doorbell rang, I had no idea that the figure standing there was not only the son I thought I had lost 2 decades ago, but also the beginning of the greatest betrayal ever prepared for me. It had only been 6 months since I lost my husband, Edward, and the emptiness his absence left behind clung to every corner of the house. Even the walls seemed to grieve with me. Each morning I brewed the tea he loved, and each evening the creak of his empty rocking chair on the veranda kept his memory alive. I tried to stay standing because life had taught me the harshest lesson of all. No matter the pain, you must go on breathing. My son, Richard, my only child, the very piece of my soul. He and his father had clashed bitterly towards the end, yet in my eyes he was always that innocent little boy. And the night he vanished, leaving behind nothing but a scrap of paper that read, "Don't come looking for me," my heart was ripped apart. For years, every knock at the door, every telephone ring rekindled the desperate hope that he had returned. But as the years dragged on with no word, I was forced to face the cruel truth that my son was gone from this world, and I had to learn to live with that loss. My late husband had been a hard-working and careful man, devoting his life to securing our future. When the solicitor told me that Edward had left everything solely to me, I felt no joy. Every penny, every brick was marked with his sweat, his labor. Without him, that inheritance was nothing but a heavy burden upon my shoulders. Then came that cursed evening. Outside, rain was lashing down in torrents while I drifted through my memories. The doorbell startled me. It was too late for neighbors, and I expected no guests. With a senseless dread weighing on my chest, I opened the door, and there he stood, drenched, disheveled, his beard unkempt, his face lined with years I could not account for. And yet, beneath all that ruin, I recognized the features of the son I had buried in my heart 2 decades before. In that instant, my world collapsed. For 20 years, I had dreamt of this moment, of my son walking through that doorway. But the reality was not the blessed miracle I had imagined. Yes, the face was his, aged and battered by God knows what sufferings. But in his eyes, there was no remorse, no warmth of a prodigal child returning home. Instead, there was a chilling coldness, a calculating sharpness, the gaze of a stranger, of a predator weighing its prey. My lips trembled as I whispered, "Richard, is it really you?" I longed for an embrace, for the words, "Yes, Mother, it's me. I've come home." But none came. He simply nodded, then, with casual indifference, asked, "I was just looking for shelter from the rain. May I come in?" As if we hadn't been parted for 20 years, as if he were no more than a neighbor stopping by. And with that, a wall of indifference crashed down upon the aching heart of a mother. My mind screamed with questions. Where have you been all this time? Did you ever think of me? Did you ever wonder if I was alive?" But my body, acting on instinct, carried me into the kitchen to prepare something warm for him. That strange force called motherhood persisted even in betrayal. With trembling hands, I made tea, while my eyes followed his every move in the sitting room, watching in dread as his gaze lingered greedily on Edward's silver frame and the old mahogany cabinet. The silence between us weighed heavier than 20 years of grief, and when at last he broke it, it was not with a son's curiosity, "How did father die?" but with words that fell like poison. "I heard father's dead. When will the solicitor divide the inheritance?" In that moment, the last fragile thread of hope within me snapped. I understood then that my son had not returned that night. My son had in truth died long ago. And yet, with that unbearable sting in my heart, something new rose from the depths of my soul, a steel-like strength I had never known. For standing before me was not my child, but a vulture draped in his likeness, come back only to pick over the bones of his father's estate. At that realization, my tears dried in an instant, and the gentle, yielding Margaret, who had endured everything, vanished. In her place stood a woman determined to defend her husband's legacy and her own dignity, no matter the cost.
It was as if time itself slowed, and instead of choking in my throat, the words lined up in my mind with the sharpness of a blade honed for 20 years. Before speaking of the inheritance, I told him, my voice like ice, that for 2 long decades, for 7,300 days and nights, I had lived without knowing whether my son was dead or alive. That every Christmas morning I had waited for a knock at the door. That on every birthday I had listened for a phone call. And now, after all those years of silence, he dared to stand before me, not to ask for forgiveness, not to ask if I had suffered, but to demand his late father's estate as though he were asking the grocer for a loaf of bread. When he realized I would not give him the tearful, forgiving mother he expected, his tone shifted at once. He launched into a long, pitiful tale of how hard his life had been abroad, how he had suffered in strange lands, and how his father's strict ways had driven him from home. But beneath the crocodile tears, I heard no trace of remorse, no whisper of longing for me. Each word reeked only of self-justification and of his arrogant conviction that he had a birthright to the wealth of the family he had abandoned. When, at last, his false performance ended, I set my knitting gently on my knees, rose to my feet, and told him that these walls had not borne witness to his invented miseries, but to my 20 years of grief, and to his father's dying gasps for the son who never came. For that reason, every penny earned by Edward's sweat, every nail in this roof, belonged not to a deserter who had cast us aside like rags, but to me, the one who had mourned, the one who had honored his memory. And I shouted that truth at him without hesitation, so that he would never forget it. In that instant, when he saw that my compassion was drained dry and his manipulations would no longer work, the real creature inside him emerged. He began muttering thinly veiled threats, insisting that he had a legal right to a share, and that if I did not yield it willingly, the courts would grind me down. As he pointed toward his father's portrait on the wall, the greed burning in his eyes showed me not only his contempt for me, but also the utter disrespect he held for his father's very memory. I told him plainly that he was now nothing but a stranger in this house, and that his threats meant nothing against my will of steel. Yet, for the sake of the storm raging outside, I offered him one last mercy. He could sleep beneath this roof for one night only, but with the sunrise, he must leave as he came. If he did not, I swore that the very laws and courts he trusted would be brought against him, not by strangers, but by his own mother. It was not kindness I offered, but one final chance to reconsider the greatest mistake of his life. That night, the first in 20 years with my son under my roof, should have been a celebration. Instead, it was a vigil of mourning. As I lay in my bed, my late husband's scent still clinging to the pillow, I did not close my eyes once. Every creak of the mattress, every breath from the next room filled me not with peace, but with the same unease as if a thief had crept into my home. I felt like a stranger in my own house. In the dead of night, when a faint creak broke the suffocating silence, my heart thundered in my throat. I slipped from my bed and, opening my door, realized the sound came not from his room, but from Edward's study, the one no one had entered since his death, where he kept the deeds, the accounts, and the most precious memories of our life together. At that moment, I understood. Richard had not returned to me at all. He had come as a grave robber, to plunder not just the inheritance, but every last remnant of his father's legacy. By the time dawn rose, fear had drained from me, leaving only cold resolve. Entering the sitting room, I found him brazenly rifling through Edward's old leather case, the one that held his most private papers. He showed no shame, no guilt. Instead, he behaved like a creditor, claiming what was due, ignoring me as though he already owned everything in sight. Perhaps he mistook my silence and the hatred in my eyes for weakness, for he stood, dropped the papers on the chair, and demanded to know where the deeds were, where the bank documents were hidden, and how much ready cash the estate held. At that moment, he not only tested the limits of my patience, but proved to me that even a mother's love has an end. At his final, insolent question, every last ember of feeling I had for him turned to ash. I set my teacup down upon the table with a sharp crack that echoed through the house, and told him flatly that he would never learn where anything was kept. His time here was over with the dawn. If he did not leave and return to whatever shadowy world had made him what he was, then he would not be carried out by my hands, but by the constables of the law.
After I uttered those words in a voice as hard as iron, I expected perhaps an outburst of rage, perhaps even a moment of hesitation. Instead, what appeared on Richard's face was a mocking smirk, followed by a hollow, soulless laugh that echoed off the sitting room walls. That laugh pierced me like shards of glass. It was the brazen declaration that he dismissed my authority as a mother, the sanctity of my home, and the 2 decades of grief I had endured. In his mind, he was already the undisputed victor. Sitting there with the arrogance of one who dared to mock his father's very spirit, He declared that though the deeds were in Edward's name, he was his only son, his rightful heir, and therefore held as much claim under this roof as I did. He told me that neither I nor the constables I threatened to call could ever drive him from this house. In that instant, the sacred notions of family and sonship were dragged down and used as cheap justifications for his greed, no more meaningful than scraps of paper. I answered him with words cold and sharp. Laws that are not tempered by conscience are nothing but cruelty, and rights that are not born with duty are nothing but arrogance. I told him that a son who had not once asked after his mother or father in 20 years had buried his own rights the moment he crossed the threshold. If he trusted the law so much, then let him explain his supposed rights in detail to the constables I was about to summon. I lifted the receiver. The moment he realized I was not bluffing, the mask of civility slipped from his face. The wild creature beneath emerged. He leapt to his feet and seized my wrist, gripping it with a cold brutality that chilled me to the bone. In that touch, I felt not only pain, but the bitter truth that this man would not hesitate to raise his hand against his own mother if it meant serving his ambition. With that venomous touch, whatever shred of pity I still clung to for him erupted into a storm of hatred. Summoning a strength I did not know I possessed, I wrenched my arm free, and with a cry that seemed to shake the walls, and perhaps Edward's very grave, I screamed but one word with every ounce of my soul: "Out!" That single word shattered 20 years of silence and grief. A terrible stillness then descended, heavier than the quarrel that had just passed. For the first time, I saw the smirk vanish from Richard's face. He realized he was no longer facing a weeping old woman, but a mother who, when her home and honor were threatened, could become more dangerous than any beast. Knowing he could not overpower me with force, he changed tactics. He spat venomous words, declaring that he would not leave without his share, that he could stay in this house for months if need be, making my life a misery. With a glare full of malice, he stormed into the very room he had deserted 2 decades before, slamming the door in my face and locking it from within, turning my own home into a prison. But when that door slammed, the storm in my mind cleared. Panic and rage gave way to a calm, icy clarity. I understood then that I could not defeat this enemy through brute force or bursts of emotion. The only way to bring him down was to turn his greatest weakness, his insatiable greed, into a weapon against him. He would dig his own grave with his own hands if only I had the patience and cunning to guide him there. The first step of my plan came swiftly. I locked Edward's study with my own key, cutting off the treasure hunt Richard had begun in the night. Then, instead of calling the constables, I reached for the number of Edward's oldest friend, his partner of 40 years, his confidant, now a retired solicitor. Mr. Harrington was the man I needed, for this battle would not be won in the courts, but in the quiet arena of wit and strategy. As I listened to Mr. Harrington outline his clever yet dangerous plan over the telephone, I felt the fiery thirst for revenge within me give way to the patience and composure of a chess player, each move calculated in advance. His first instruction was the hardest. Despite my hatred, I must stop confronting Richard directly. Instead, I had to act as though I had surrendered, as though I were a frightened, helpless mother cowed by his threats. For me, it was like grasping a snake to escape a lion, but my unwavering trust in Edward's lifelong friend gave me the courage to play this role. The first and most difficult step of the plan was to prepare a meal for the very man who had only hours earlier dared to raise his hand against me, as though nothing had happened, as though he was still my beloved son. As I kneaded dough and baked bread with my own hands, preparing every dish he had adored in his youth, I knew this was not an act of motherly love. It was the ritual of a hunter baiting her trap with deadly patience, and only that thought allowed me to endure the revulsion that knotted my stomach. When I approached his locked door with a tray of his favorite dishes, Mr. Harrington's words echoed in my mind. A hungry wolf is at his weakest when food is laid before him, and Richard's pride and greed are his deepest hunger. I silenced the hatred in my heart and softened my voice with a tenderness he had not heard in decades. "My son, you must be starving. Your mother has made all your favorites. Please don't be stubborn. Come and have a bite." The sound of the key turning on the other side nearly made my heart leap from my chest. Yet I held my role. When the door opened a fraction, I saw his eyes, narrow, suspicious, darting from my face, where he read only feigned submission, to the tray of food he coveted. In his smug expression, I could read the foolish thoughts racing through his mind, that he had broken my will, that his threats had worked, that he had already won this battle. He snatched the tray from my hands without a word of thanks, like a creditor taking what was owed, and shut the door in my face. But this time, there was no sound of a lock turning. That silence was proof that Mr. Harrington had been right. Our plan was working. The unlocked door meant he no longer saw me as a threat, no longer considered me dangerous. It was the silent signal that our prey had taken the bait, and we were ready to spring the second, deadliest stage of the trap. I waited, steadying my racing heart for the perfect moment, the moment when a predator, belly full and guard lowered, was at its most vulnerable. Then I stepped into the room with the paper that would decide his fate, ready to play the most important role of my life. Inside, the threatening brute had vanished. In his place sat a smug man, sated with food, basking in his imagined triumph. I delivered the speech Mr. Harrington had crafted, each word dripping with weary resignation. I told him I was too old and too tired to endure years of court battles, that I wanted everything resolved quietly, that I had no strength left to fight. My sudden surrender stroked his ego so deeply that suspicion never even entered his mind. I told him I was prepared to sign over the shop in town and a considerable portion of the money in the bank to him the very next day. All I asked in return was that he sign a simple waiver stating that he would make no further claims in future. His eyes widened with greed, almost bulging from their sockets. In the paper I handed him looked like an ordinary agreement, but it was a mine carefully laid by Mr. Harrington's decades of legal expertise. Hidden amongst the clauses was a single devastating admission that Richard had, of his own free will, abandoned his duties as a son for 20 years, neglecting his family entirely. Under English inheritance law, such an admission could be used to strip him of his rights to Edward's estate completely. A man who had never opened a book in his life, who had always despised reading, Richard did not bother to examine the document. Blinded by the thought of money and property, he snatched the pen from my hand and scrawled his signature with a greedy flourish. In that moment, he signed not only a few pieces of paper, but his own disinheritance. He had sealed his fate, and as I watched his foolish grin of triumph, I felt only an icy calm settle over me.
As Richard pressed his pen down and the scratch of his hurried signature cut across the page, the sound was to me the sweetest melody this house had ever known. Beneath that foolish grin of his, I folded the paper with deliberate calm, knowing it was not victory I held in my hands, but merely the outcome of the first skirmish in a bloody war. For the devil before me was not the sort of enemy to surrender after a single stroke of ink. His greedy impatience gave me the perfect opening for the next stage of our plan. With a weary sigh, I told him that the solicitor's office would, of course, be closed at such a late hour, but that if I held on to the signed agreement, I could take it to Mr. Harrington in the morning so that the bank and deeds could be dealt with properly. In truth, I had not only secured the most crucial piece of evidence out of his hands, but also managed to keep him trapped in his false sense of triumph for another day. For as Mr. Harrington had reminded me, the more hope you feed a man, the sharper the bite of his disappointment. Walking away from my own home, leaving an enemy to lurk within its walls, I felt an odd mix of unease and determination. Each step toward Mr. Harrington's chambers carried me closer not only to legal victory, but also to the release of a 20-year burden that had weighed upon my soul. The glow of the city lights beyond the car window flickered like reflections of my thoughts of vengeance, and I realized that I was no longer a grieving widow, but a woman prepared to defend what was hers by whatever means were necessary. Mr. Harrington studied the signed document with the precision of a surgeon before declaring it flawless. He told me it was no ordinary sheet of paper, but the sharpest weapon we could wield in court. Richard's own written admission, carefully disguised, but damning enough to disinherit him entirely from Edward's estate. When he uttered the words, "petition for disinheritance," the true gravity of the road I had chosen struck me. There was no turning back, no room left for maternal pity. And just as I allowed myself the smallest breath of relief, Mr. Harrington delivered the words that chilled me. "Mrs. Margaret, the real battle begins now. A wounded beast is always most dangerous when it realizes all is lost. Once Richard receives the summons, he will lash out, he will slander you, he will seek to break you. When you return home, you must play not the helpless mother, but a fortress of iron. If that fortress falls, we all fall with it." When I stepped back over the threshold of my home, I felt like an actress stepping onto a stage for the hardest performance of her life. For there he was, waiting, greedy eyes fixed on me, pestering with questions. What had the solicitor said? When would he see the money? When would it all be his? And I, just as rehearsed, answered with the weariness of a beaten woman. He'll need to review the papers. Tomorrow will tell. I'm far too tired now. The look of frustration that flashed across his face as I retreated left him to stew until morning was almost as satisfying as the signature itself. That night, unlike the terror of the previous one, I slept with the composure of a commander awaiting her enemy's next move. From the adjoining room came the restless sound of his pacing, each footfall betraying his gnawing impatience. And in the quiet, I savored the cruel satisfaction of knowing that after all the games he had played with me, I was now the one dictating the rules. At dawn, Richard was dressed and ready as though he would march to the bank that very moment. I, however, deliberately slowed my every action, watering plants, preparing tea, turning his anticipation into a slow torture. Each delay stoked his fury, and each glance from his eyes burning with "Hurry up!" only gave me strength. With every wasted minute, I was buying Mr. Harrington the precious time he needed to set the case in motion. When the inevitable outburst came, I responded exactly as rehearsed. With my most innocent expression, I told him I had phoned Mr. Harrington, but that a minor complication and outstanding tax matter on the shop we were to transfer would delay things by a day or two. Nothing serious, nothing to worry about. The flicker of suspicion, rage, and despair that crossed his face in that moment was proof of how perfectly the plan was unfolding. For no man is easier to deceive than one who hears precisely what he longs to believe. Unable to argue against such a simple, reasonable lie, he stormed off once more, slamming the door to his room so hard the walls shook. I knew then I had won another battle that day. Yet the echo of that door closing was not victory's song. It was the sound of a wounded predator retreating to its lair, full of rage and suspicion. And in the silence that settled over the house, I knew the storm was far from over.
That day, the silence which settled over the house was more frightening than the quarrels of the days before, for it was no longer the hush of waiting, but the silence of a predator lying in ambush. From behind his door, I caught the low murmur of Richard's telephone conversations, whispered words to someone I could not identify, and I knew deep down that he no longer believed my stories. He was seeking counsel elsewhere, perhaps from another solicitor, and the careful web Mr. Harrington and I had spun might be on the verge of unraveling. Summoning what courage I had left, I moved towards his door, only for it to open suddenly. There he stood, eyes brimming with hatred and suspicion. In those frozen seconds of silence, we said nothing, yet his piercing gaze told me clearly that he no longer believed a helpless mother before him, but a cunning adversary intent on trapping him. Shaken, I hurried to ring Mr. Harrington and told him that Richard was becoming suspicious. In his usual calm, steady voice, he urged me to be patient.
He reminded me that our move had already been made. The petition for disinheritance had been filed, and by the next day, an officer of the court would arrive at my door to hand Richard the official summons, sealed and stamped. The countdown had begun, but Richard's temper frayed before the summons could be delivered. He stormed out of his room, coat half buttoned, declaring that he would go himself to the tax office to uncover the discrepancy I had spoken of, swearing he would no longer be tricked by my games. His sudden decision threatened to unravel everything. If he discovered the truth from a clerk or another solicitor before the court officer arrived, our greatest weapon, the element of surprise, would be lost. The moment the door slammed behind him, I was on the telephone to Mr. Harrington, panic flooding my voice. I explained that Richard was out of our control, chasing the truth, and that if he uncovered our petition before its time, the plan might collapse. Yet Mr. Harrington, ever the strategist, spoke as though he had anticipated this very move. He assured me that Edward's good name and his own long-standing reputation in the city were shields stronger than Richard's brute temper. By now, a few quiet calls had been made, and in any office Richard visited, he would meet only polite delays, endless forms, and the slow grind of bureaucracy. Waiting for him to return was torture beyond even the 20 years of grief I had endured. For this time, my tormentor was not uncertainty alone, but my own flesh and blood, now a stranger moving about the world beyond my sight. I could not know whom he spoke to, what lies he spun, or what plots he hatched. Every corner of the house closed in on me with dark imaginings. What if he sees through it? What if he secures another solicitor? What if he comes back to destroy me? In my mind, I pictured him barging into an office with his usual bluster, demanding answers, only to be met by a civil servant, already primed by Mr. Harrington, shrugging and saying, "That file's under review, sir. System's down. Best try again tomorrow." I imagined his anger boiling as he left with nothing to show for it, his fists clenched, his pride bruised. But I knew Richard well enough to be sure he would not stop there. Inevitably, he would find his way into another solicitor's chambers, spilling out our family's private affairs in pursuit of the inheritance. The thought of him, my son, conspiring with a stranger against his own mother for money, struck me with a dread no reassurance could soothe. When at last the front door opened that evening, it was not the furious man of the morning who returned, but a Richard transformed. His face was calm, almost satisfied, yet there was a coldness to it that chilled me more than his anger ever had. He offered no explanation, no word of where he had been. He merely met my eyes with a knowing smile, a smile that said he was no longer alone in this fight, that he had found an advisor of his own, and that the rules of the game were about to be rewritten. Without another word, he withdrew to his room, and in that moment I understood the true danger was only just beginning.
That night, the calmness on Richard's face, that frozen half-smile, chilled me far more than all his shouting and threats. I realized then that whoever this new solicitor of his was, he had not only armed him with legal maneuvers, but also taught him how to wage a psychological war within my own walls, how to unsettle me, break my nerves, and force me into a mistake. From that moment, my home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, every hour spent waiting for his next move. By morning, I began to understand the new strategy. As I busied myself in the kitchen, I could hear him in the sitting room, feigning a casual telephone conversation, but letting his words fall like poison darts. Of course, when the elderly lose their faculties, they no longer know how to manage their estates. That's when the children must step in, have a guardian appointed by the court. That's what the law says. He might as well have been looking me in the eye and calling me mad, threatening to strip me of control over my own life. When I fled to the garden for air, he followed, tape measure in hand, pretending to inspect the foundations and boundaries as though he was some architect. Without uttering a word, he was declaring, "This will be mine soon. I'll tear it all down and remake it as I please." Every stretch of that measure mocked the memories Edward and I had carved into those walls and paths, trampling my existence without so much as a spoken insult. The cruel climax came at supper. I sat trying to eat a crust of bread, only to see him slide into the chair that had belonged to Edward for decades. He said nothing, simply stared at me across the table while eating his meal, as though he were already master of this house. It was the vilest way to proclaim that my authority here was finished, that he was the heir, the new patriarch. That night, behind the safety of my bedroom door, I realized how deeply his psychological warfare had drained me. For one fleeting moment, I considered surrender, leaving it all behind. But then I saw Edward's weary yet dignified face in my mind's eye, felt his presence in every brick of this house. I brushed away my tears and sent word to Mr. Harrington. "We cannot wait any longer. We must act to drive him out." It was time to stop defending and begin striking back. When my telephone rang, it was Mr. Harrington's firm, reassuring voice. He told me my endurance under Richard's psychological torment was not wasted. It strengthened our case, denying him any claim that I had provoked him. But the waiting was nearly at an end. The court officer would arrive the next morning to serve him with the official writ, sealed and stamped. At once I felt fear and relief. The moment of reckoning was almost here. The following morning, I endured his arrogance, his idle boasts, as though the estate were already in his pocket. Each tick of the grandfather clock felt like a hammer blow to my chest. I knew the next sound of the doorbell would shatter the false peace forever. And when it came, sharp, shrill, cutting through the house like an alarm, I saw Richard's smug composure falter just for an instant. My heart thundered, but my steps to the door were steady, for I knew what waited beyond was not merely a court officer, but the embodiment of long-delayed justice. The official stood at the threshold asking for Mr. Richard Whitmore by name and handed over the envelope sealed with the crest of the family court. He took it with a mixture of curiosity and irritation, as though expecting money or deeds inside. Watching him break the seal, his expression shifting from confusion aversion to dread was like seeing a film reel slow to a crawl. As his eyes scanned the lines, I watched the blood drain from his face. Then he reached the words, "Petition for disinheritance," and beneath, in the evidence section, the damning clause, his own signature on the so-called deed of renunciation, drafted with Mr. Harrington's cunning hand. In that instant, he understood he had been tricked by his own greed. His composure broke. The papers crumpled in his fist as he roared, a beast cornered, "How dare you do this to me?" It was not the cry of an angry son, but the howl of a predator caught in his own snare, betrayed, humiliated, stripped bare before the truth.
With his roar, it felt as though the very walls of the house, every piece of furniture, every memory, trembled in terror. For standing before me was no longer a furious man, but a cornered beast, blinded by rage, intent only on destroying. His first blow was not against me, but against my heart. The priceless antique vase Edward and I had found at a market so many years ago, shattered against the wall, splintering not only porcelain, but also my memories. As the sound of breaking glass still echoed, Richard advanced with hate-filled strides, driving me into a corner. For the first time in my life, I felt death pressing close. He raged that I would pay for this betrayal, that he would disgrace me in court, have false doctors' reports drawn up to declare me unfit and shut me away in an asylum so he alone could claim the house. In his eyes I saw no trace of my son, only the cold, hollow stare of a man who could as easily have been a murderer. At the very instant his poisonous hand reached out to seize my arm, I remembered Mr. Harrington's warning. If it turns ugly, don't fight him. Press this and scream. My trembling fingers slammed down on the little device he had given me. Suddenly, a piercing alarm filled the house, shrill, relentless, my silent scream breaking into sound. It froze him for a moment, as though the prospect of witnesses, of neighbors rushing to see, was more terrifying to him than any punishment. That fleeting hesitation was my one chance. I slipped past him and ran harder than I had ever done in my life, out into the cold night air. Each gulp of icy breath reminded me I was alive. Behind me echoed the wreckage of the home I had cherished and the bellow of a beast caged in his own fury. Barefoot, I fled past the fearful, curious eyes of neighbors who had gathered at the sound of the alarm. In that moment I knew my house was no longer a home, and I was now a fugitive in my own land. That night, when I reached the door of Edward's dearest friend, Mr. Harrington, I was welcomed not with suspicion, but with compassion. He and his wife pressed a hot cup of tea into my shaking hands, trying to warm a soul frozen with grief. But the trembling in me came not from fear alone, but from the guilt of abandoning my husband's legacy to a raging intruder. When I told him of Richard's madness, how he had torn through the house, threatened me, and shown the eyes of a killer, Mr. Harrington showed no surprise. Instead, with calm certainty, he said, "Now he has sealed his own fate." He made calls at once.
Richard's violence, the alarm, the broken possessions, the neighbors who had heard my screams, all this would not only support our case to disinherit him, but would also justify an order to have him removed from the house. Even as I sat in that safe haven, my mind was back in my ruined home. I imagined Richard amidst the wreckage, perhaps scheming with that new solicitor of his, perhaps plotting some fresh act of malice. Would he set fire to the house, lock himself inside to bar my return? The thought of leaving Edward's legacy to such desecration gnawed at me with guilt. Mr. Harrington reassured me that Richard would not spend another night there. By morning, he would ensure a court order was in place, an injunction forbidding Richard from approaching me, entering the house, or even contacting me. It would be a clean, legal severance. Yet with that relief came a burden heavier than any I had known. The shame of forcing the law to drive out my own son. That stain would live on my soul forever. But that night, in the warmth of their home, I silenced the part of me that still whimpered for him as a mother. I understood at last. I no longer had a son called Richard. What I had was an intruder, an enemy who had invaded my life. And until that enemy was cast out, until Edward's house was safe once more, I would not weep. I would not falter. However ugly this war became, I would fight it to the end.
The next morning, as I walked down my own street, flanked by a solicitor and a police escort, I felt both the deepest shame and the sharpest pain of my life. The street that had once been the address of my peace and my memories now looked, in the eyes of my neighbors, like a crime scene. And I, Margaret, would forever be remembered as the pitiable woman who had needed the state's constables to drive her own son from her home. When I stood at the threshold and heard the heavy, official knock of a policeman's fist on my own front door, the sound struck not the oak, but my chest. In the deadly silence before any answer came, 1,000 fears clawed at my mind. What if he refused to open? What if he harmed himself? What if he destroyed the house? Yet beneath it all, I knew my truest dread. The look I would see in Richard's eyes when that door finally opened. And when it did, when he saw not only me but also the cold face of authority embodied in 2 uniformed officers, I witnessed the collapse of his false reign in an instant. The brute force, the threats, the cruel psychological warfare he had used against me, all of it crumbled when confronted with the iron wall of law and order. The panic in his eyes betrayed it all. Under an officer's watch, I watched as he stuffed a few belongings into a bag, like a common thief being evicted from his own spoils. There was no triumph in me, no relief, only the unbearable sight of a mother's son reduced to a humiliated, defeated figure weighed on me like a mountain. In that moment, I understood there would be no victors in this war. As he was led out, Richard turned for one final look. That gaze is burned into my soul. Not the remorse of a child, but the eyes of a sworn enemy, an oath of vengeance that promised the battle was far from over. When the door shut behind him, though I had regained my house, I knew I had also won a lifelong foe. The silence that followed inside was not the silence of victory, but the suffocating quiet of survival after an earthquake, when the city lies in ruins. The shards on the floor were not just porcelain, but the shattered remains of 20 years of maternal hope, of the dream of family, of the peace this home had once held. As I stooped to gather them, I realized I was not piecing together a vase, but my broken heart. It was Mr. Harrington's calm but resolute voice that drew me back to reality. He reminded me we had won the skirmish for the house, but the true battle, the trial, still lay ahead. Richard's new counsel would surely attack me in court. They would question my age, perhaps even my sanity. They would claim the signature had been forced, that I had manipulated him. And we, he said, must stand firm with our witnesses and, above all, that fatal affidavit, the paper Richard himself had signed, damning his own claim. Turning over those fears in my mind, I stepped into Richard's now empty room and saw the desolation he had left. On the nightstand lay a crumpled scrap of paper. When I picked it up, I saw for the first time the name and number of a solicitor I did not know. In that moment, I understood. Our enemy was no longer just my wayward son, but also a professional prepared to sell his craft to defend his lies. With that paper in my hand, I returned to Mr. Harrington. Whatever doubt still lingered in me vanished like mist. Whoever this man is, I told him, let him know this. He will not face a feeble old woman, but a mother ready to defend her late husband's honor and her home until her last breath. I was ready, at last, to step into that court and speak the truth of 20 years without one lie, from beginning to end. In the weeks that followed, I repaired the broken walls and swept away the wreckage, but I knew the rubble in my soul would not lift until the gavel fell in that courtroom. The witnesses were ready, the evidence gathered. All that remained was to face the trial. I no longer trembled at the thought of the courthouse. Instead, I waited, steady and resolved, for the day I would play the final act of my story before the stern eyes of justice.
For years I had only heard of courtrooms in films, yet there I was, walking down those echoing corridors towards the most important confrontation of my life. With each step, I felt the weight not only of my own honor, but of Edward's good name and the sweat with which he had earned every penny of his estate. When I pushed open the door to the courtroom and saw Richard sitting with his sly solicitor at his side, looking at me as though I were a stranger, the full bitterness of a mother bringing her son to court cut through me once again. When their polished, silver-tongued barrister rose and declared that I had lost my wits after my husband's death, that I had been manipulated by Mr. Harrington into turning against my own child, and that the signed declaration was nothing but the result of emotional exploitation, it was as if I had been punched in the stomach. My 20 years of grief were reduced to senility, my suffering twisted into vulnerability. When the judge called my name and I stepped into the witness box, I thought the very walls were closing in on me. Yet with each step, I grew stronger. For in that moment, I was not only Margaret, I was the voice of every mother wronged, every widow left behind, every person whose labor had been betrayed. At the judge's command to tell us, I began from the very start, unflinching, unbroken.
recounting every day of those 20 years of waiting, my eyes fixed firmly on his. When my story ended, the barrister pounced like a vulture. He twisted his questions, belittled my memory, mocked my maternal instincts, hoping to drive me into confusion or fury. But I had one defense stronger than all his clever words. The raw truth of the pain I had lived, carved into me too deeply ever to be shaken. At last, when his assault was done, Mr. Harrington rose with his quiet dignity. He presented the document, Richard's own hand and signature, his admission that he had abandoned his family for 20 years, that he had failed in the most fundamental duties of a son. When the judge lifted the paper and read, the entire room fell into a graveyard silence. I watched his face as his eyes moved down the page, then watched the sharp glance he turned upon Richard over the rim of his glasses. At last, the wheels of justice had begun to turn. The moment stretched like eternity. I knew that the few words about to fall from the judge's lips would seal 20 years of sorrow and waiting. The barrister's tricks, Mr. Harrington's steady presence, all of it faded. What I heard was only Richard's ragged breathing, the sound of a man who sensed his fate. And then it came. This court, having examined the evidence, in particular the documents signed by the defendant admitting his prolonged and willful neglect of his filial duties, hereby upholds the petition of the claimant, Mrs. Margaret Whitfield. The defendant, Richard Whitfield, is disinherited from the estate of his late father, Edward Whitfield. And with the rap of the gavel, the judgment was final. I did not feel triumph. I felt the cauterization of a wound that had bled for 20 years, a searing, empty calm. As Richard's shoulders sagged, the mask of arrogance and greed slid away, leaving only a hollowed-out man. In that moment, I could not even hate him. What I saw was not a monster, not an enemy, but a boy lost to his own avarice, pitiable in his ruin. And as a mother, against all reason, I felt one last pang of sorrow for him. When I stepped out of that grim, airless building and the spring sunlight struck my face, the breath I drew was the freest I had ever known. I felt mountains fall from my shoulders, chains break around my soul. I had not merely defended a house or an inheritance. I had reclaimed the right to live what years remained to me in peace. Now, alone again within these walls, I understand that no one has won this war. I lost a son. He lost both his past and his future. But Edward, I kept safe your house, your name, your honor. I did not betray your trust. Our son may have lost his way, but our love and our home have endured. And in this silence, I live on, not in punishment, but in the peace I have fought so hard to deserve, with your memory as my steadfast companion.